Hello and welcome to this lecture with Karl-Stéphan Bouthillette and the SOAS Centre of Yoga Studies. I'm Ruth Westerby. I'm a doctoral student at SOAS and a member of the SOAS Centre of Yoga Studies. Thank you for joining us, either live or through our YouTube channel. Welcome to those of you who are familiar with the CYS, or perhaps you're new to our work. We're a research centre at SOAS London, where we're a hub for scholars, students, and all those interested in yoga. This lecture is an outcome of moving some of our activities online as a result of the coronavirus. We had initially invited Karl-Stéphan to speak on a seminar series on yoga and philosophy, which unfortunately we had to postpone. We are offering elements of that seminar series online. Karen O'Brien-Kopp, another scholar we had lined up to speak on that programme, has already recorded for us, and Mikkel Burley is going to speak for us soon. We hope to reschedule in as interactive a format as possible the sessions we had planned with Diwakar Acharya, Jessica Frazier, and Chakravarti Ramprasad. So please do keep an eye on our Facebook and Instagram accounts for all our forthcoming events. Tonight's event is being recorded for our YouTube channel, and you can view all of our previous lectures there. We have a separate tool, Slido, which you can use for asking questions. You will have received the login details on your invite to this event. If you add your name to the question when you post it on Slido, we will endeavour to unmute you so that you can ask your question for yourself. So let me introduce our speaker. Karl-Stéphan Bouthillette received his PhD in Indian philosophy from the Institute of Indology and Tibetology at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. He was a research fellow in Leiden with a Jan Gonda Fellowship and is currently at Ghent with an FWO postdoctoral research grant. For today's talk, Nodes of Yoga, the Path of Knowledge through Philosophical Doxography, he will draw on current research and his recently published monograph with Routledge entitled Dialogue and Doxography in Indian Philosophy, Points of View in Buddhist, Jaina, and Advaita Vedanta traditions. So thank you ever so much, Karl-Stéphan. I'm very much looking forward to this. Let me hand over to you.
Well, thank you, Ruth, and thank you also, Marta, for the invitation and for organizing this. I am quite in admiration with the work that is being done at SOAS, at the Center of Yoga Studies. I think the multidisciplinarity is quite a way forward for Indology. I hope many more will embrace that path. I think in general, yoga studies have become quite multidisciplinary. In any case, I feel quite humbled to be invited, to present my work to you. Let me now bring in the PowerPoint. Here, 1 second. I have to get used to this technology. I will share the screen with you in a second. Right. Here we go. So perhaps before I jump in the crux of the matter, I could try to frame it a little bit and say a few words concerning yoga in general. If there was perhaps just one thing that I hope one could grasp and bring back from this talk, perhaps it would be this: that the common view that we have on yoga now has become quite diverse. Yet perhaps if we look at the way yoga is presented in the mainstream, and even in some ancient texts, we tend to believe that yoga is mainly an activity in quieting the mind, if not in shutting down the mind altogether. So we seldom associate yoga with, let's say, debates and analysis, dialectic and rhetoric and logic and reasoning. Yet in fact, when we look at the literatures of those, at least at the many who considered themselves engaged on a kind of yogic path, toward a form of freedom and liberation, we see a very intense intellectual activity, yeah, at play. Yeah? That's perhaps at the cause of the production of such a vast amount of literature. And so today, perhaps my talk will try to see why is it so, what's the relevance, yeah, of these studies and of cultivating the intellect, and especially of philosophy in the context of one's practice of yoga. Obviously, I'm not going to essentialize and say, well, yoga is this and not that. That's not my point. It's simply to point out that for many, philosophy was part and parcel of their yogic path towards a form or another of liberation. And if I was to resume, yeah, this philosophical yoga in a nutshell, well, perhaps the title that I have here, especially with the image, you know, of the glasses, yeah, nerds of yoga, perhaps I could sum it up in some way, as I will argue in the talk, that philosophical yoga, to use a metaphor of the glasses, philosophical yoga somehow teaches us or shows us that we all wear glasses and helps us identify these glasses, and perhaps even, I suggest, to remove them altogether. So now this talk is based on a book that I recently published. It just came out a few weeks back at Routledge. Obviously, I'm not going to go through all of the book, but we'll see together. I hope we'll have enough time to go through the main frame of the book. So more or less what we'll talk about is what is a doxography, yeah, because the book is about doxography, and that might already seem quite removed from the topic of yoga, but we'll see about that. And then moving on to what is a view, yeah, because doxographies are compiling views. And what is the relation between doxography, views, and spiritual exercises? Then finally, I will briefly show three models of doxography that I have examined in the book. If I am to summarize, you know, in a very nutshell, what I'm going to talk about, I could say that ultimately, I will argue that the path of knowledge is a path where views or sight is being purified. So the path of knowledge, I argue, purifies sight. And ultimately, success in philosophical yoga means transcending all views. Now that might sound very appealing and perhaps even modern, right? And perhaps a bit too much essentializing and spiritualizing. So we also have to put that back in a more conventional context. And notice that the path of knowledge is based on discrimination, right? What the Sankhya, or what in Sanskrit we would call viveka. So cultivating discrimination, getting to know and discriminate the good from the bad, the true from the false, the universal from the particular, and so on. And though I said that ultimately success in philosophical yoga means transcending all view, conventionally yogic philosophers always defend one view as the only valid path, and not only their view as the best, but really their view as the only valid one. And that's quite interesting as well, because here we have perhaps a kind of dialectic of the sacred and profane, and when we keep these two perspectives in mind, we can also see in the way that yogic philosophy presents his argument in a context that has to be embedded, right, in a society, and that has a political impact as well. And these are points I touch more in the book, on which I will unfortunately not touch too much here, unless you want to discuss about that, right, in the question period. So to begin with, what is a doxography? I understand that it is not obvious to everyone, so I have built up a definition of doxography based on the work that has been done in classical studies, because actually the term itself, yeah, has been coined by classicists. We find a lot of different types of doxographies in the Greco-Roman world. So by evaluating, analyzing the theories of classicists about doxographies, I came up with a definition which I find rather universal and will be helpful here to frame what it is that I'm talking about. So to begin with, a doxography is either a whole text or a part of a text where competing views of philosophers or schools are presented following a divisions of topics, yeah, organized into sets and subsets with specific difference to which a name label is attached in most cases, right? So the school such and such, and then, you know, that makes one chapter, for example, and then, or one paragraph, and then another school, and so forth. Then also, doxography is a text where the original argumentative supports of the views of the philosophers may or may not be given, where the author's own view and argument may or may not be criticized, where the content consists either in literal or in non-literal rendering of sources. And finally, I argue that where the overall concern is primarily systematic, dialectic, and with little or no historiographical character. Now, perhaps some would say this definition is contentious, while scholars have argued, right, for a more narrow definition. This one is quite broad. The end of that definition, where I go talking about that these texts are not historiographical per se, is actually an answer to the way that Indian doxographies have been read quite often and used by different scholars as, let's say, a way to either date specific doctrines, or to anyway kind of have an idea or to depict the history of Indian philosophy. And that can be quite problematic, for as I will explain, these texts are more systematic and dialectic, quite rhetorical as well, hence their relation to historical reality is rather minimal, though that does not mean that we cannot use these texts for historiographical purposes as well. So here, let me move on this little screen. So I argue that no Indian doxography is purely neutral, but that all follow a dialectical scheme coherent with the author's worldview. This is what I will explain by the end of that talk. I will illustrate how that works. And the reason I'm saying this is that some people I've seen, especially in doxographies coming out of the Jaina circle, some people have argued that Jain doxographies, for example, were rather neutral, and I do not believe so. So even if Indian doxographies essentially present doctrinal summaries, I argue that one should not take it for granted that this structural pattern alone determines their function, right? Merely to summarize. So, well, because they are a summary, then their purpose was to summarize Indian philosophy. I rather suggest that such a systematic summary is but a formal feature, perhaps of mnemonic import, subordinated to another predominant function, here the dialectical and therapeutic function of studying opposing views within the given religious context. This I will explain further. But before, moving on to looking at doxographies and so forth, now that I have provided, let's say, a definition of the structure of the text and how they are built, let's talk a bit about their content. And that's quite important, especially for my argument, that that philosophical yoga is about noticing that we wear glasses and that we can at some point either clean the glasses a little bit or remove them altogether. So what is actually a view? What is this content, these darshanas that are listed in doxographies. To do that, I will say present three types of answers. One, a pragmatic answer, more or less, right, to help you out, introduce the subject, and then a more technical answer, and then a more philosophical answer. So the pragmatic answer would be that darshanas, right, are basic worldviews of communities. So when we talk of an Indian philosophical system or so forth, we generally refer to the Sanskrit term darshana, from the root drish, to see, which literally alludes to a view. There's a beautiful article, a beautiful elaboration on the term darshana by Habfas in India and Europe. I won't go through this all here, but when we think of Indian philosophical system, generally we refer to that term darshana, which is literally a view, vision perhaps. Darshanas are always an idealization, an abstraction, since the real internal discourses of each system are never like the coherent unit presented, especially in doxographies. So these darshanas, especially that presented in doxographies, presented kind of in a nutshell, in an ideal, non-historical manner. It feels like they have never moved, that the system just appear altogether formed, right? In doxographies, we see also, these darshanas, they are represented through paraphrase and extract from little text, and these are compiled and they provide kind of, an ideal view of what would be, let's say, the main opinions, the main tenets, of a particular system. And it would be worth remembering that these representations are ideal. They never represent, the historical development. So in brief, darshanas are a basic worldview of a given community, for example, right? Darshana of the Buddhists, darshanas of the Advaitins, and so forth. Authors generally talk about darshanas when alluding to others. At the beginning, even the authors used, especially in Buddhist context, the word drishti to refer to others, and that word had a rather pejorative connotation. Right? It is others that have views, while our system is not just a view; it's it's reality or so forth. That's progressively developed, that term, and by the, let's say, 8th, 7th to 9th century, we have appearing the term darshana as a rather technical term, alludes to systems. But people talk about darshanas when they want to talk about different views than their own, generally. Thus, darshanas are particularly significant in a dialogical context, here to borrow the dialogical from Bakhtin. So this discussions on darshanas and the possibility of having darshana, actually, it happens because there are a multiplicity of different points of views of different communities believing in different things. And this leads me actually to a quote that I found from Jonathan Smith, historian of religion, a quote which I feel frames very well, the context in which we can see perhaps the emerging of the need for a notion of darshana and for doxographies especially. Smith says, while the other may be perceived as being either like us or not like us, he is in fact most problematic when he is too much like us, or when he claims to be us. It is here that the real urgency of the theory of the other emerges. This urgency is called forth not by the requirement to place the other, but rather to situate ourselves. It is here to invoke the language of a theory of ritual that we are not so much concerned with the drama of expulsion, but with the more mundane and persistent processes of micro-adjustment. This is not a matter of the far, but preeminently of the near. The problem is not alterity, but similarity, at times even identity. A theory of the other is but another way of phrasing a theory of the self. And here I find this quote quite relevant because actually darshanas now emerge in a context where different schools have to somehow respond to others. They have to delimit their theoretical and doctrinal foundation and distinguish it from various claims. Yeah, I mean, we can see that in a kind of marketing manner. But yes, I feel that this quote here of Smith somehow help us somehow see how plural the Indian philosophical context was. And for those who are not too familiar with Indian philosophy, I kind of made here a short little table of the different schools that one might find. There's actually more than that, but these are often the general schools that we see appearing in encyclopedias of Indian philosophies and so forth, right? The Charvaka, like the materialist schools, the Jaina schools, the Bauddha schools, which themselves are subdivided, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Samkhya, and Yoga, which you are more familiar to, the Purva and Uttara Mimamsa, here the Vedanta, if you want, right? Which could be, I mean, there are perhaps 12 or 16 schools about of Vedanta. There's also at least 2 schools of Mimamsa itself. So all of these could be said to be darshanas, right? So we see there is a plurality here of perspective, and these schools are in dialogue with one another. The one on which, the 3 doxographies on which I worked actually came from the environment of the Jains, or the Shvetambara, from the Haribhadra, from Madhyamika, from the Madhyamika Buddhism, the text of Bhaviveka, and the Vedanta Advaita, the text which is attributed to Shankara. So my work involved the early doxographies of 3 different schools. As I said, Madhyamika Buddhism. I looked at the Madhyamika Hridaya Karika of Bhaviveka, at the Shat-darshana Samuchaya of Haribhadra, and at the Sarva Siddhanta Sangraha of Shankara. Now these texts are, I mean, especially Bhaviveka's text is rather long, so I chose to work on only one section, only one darshana, the same within each book, the darshana of Mimamsa. Here, I won't talk very much about that, or not at all, within this talk. But here, just to give you an overview of what you would find if you were to read the book. Let's look at the text a bit more closely, although we'll come back on that later. Now, I just want to give you an idea. But if we look at the framework or the table of content, if you want, of these texts, we see again these classification, these darshanas coming back. So here on the verses, on the essence of the middle way from Bhaviveka, we see that he talked about the Shravaka and the Yogacara, which are 2 schools of Buddhism, and then he engaged with Sankhya, with Vaisheshika, with the Vedanta, and finally with the Mimamsa. Actually, for your interest, there is a slight discussion on yoga in that book, which is actually in that text, which is to be found, interestingly, in the Mimamsa chapter. If we look at the Jaina text of Haribhadra, the compendium of 6 views, we see, all right, he engaged with Buddhists, with Nyaya, Samkhya, all of these, say, main darshanas. And similarly, for the Sarvasiddhanta Sangraha, here we see some names that we hadn't seen so far, like Patanjali Yoga, Vedavyasa, and so forth, Vedanta. So this is a broad picture, all right, of different darshanas. Now, to come back to our question, what is exactly a darshana? What is these views? What are these views? I now approach the question in a more technical manner. I say, well, darshanas are the contents of Indian doxography. That might sound obvious, but let's look at it even closer. So Indian doxographies are interested in established philosophical system, worldviews, and darshanas, right? Their focus is on what the Greeks would call endoxa, a well-known consensual view held by an expert or by a group of people. There was a conference here about a year, a bit more, 2 years ago, on classical doxography by Islamic, Christian, and classical doxography. And Han Baldussen had argued that actually we should call doxographies and doxography and not just doxography, for what we found in most of them is mainly well-known consensual views, and that's the case for Indian doxographies as well. But the Greek term mainly conveys the shared dimension of such opinions, whereas the term darshana also came to carry an implicit definition of the content of views. A darshana is an opinion held by an authority, in Sanskrit, an apta. All right, so that seems okay. We could say it's an endoxa, but there is more. It also comes with a set of principles established through a given epistemology amounting to various means of knowledge, right? These three elements, apta, tattva, and pramanas, are what is generally found in Indian doxographical list. One could say that they constitute the very backbone of Indian philosophy. So to sum it up somehow, a darshana technically, at the very least, is a systematic presentation of a view of a community where we would find a doctrinal authority, right? For the Nyaya, for example, their authority, their apta, was said by Haribhadra to be Shiva, right? For the Mimamsa, some would say, well, the authority of the Mimamsa is the Veda itself. For the Buddhist, it is Buddha. For the Jain, it is the Jina. So there is an authority, and that authority teaches, and these teachings are somehow encapsulated within a different, let's say, elementary truth. So tattvas, there are so many depending on the schools, but one could think of here, for example, the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism could be argued to be tattvas. But here we have, hence, an authority, a set of truth, and then we have the pramanas, which should never be forgotten, because pramanas are the means that the different systems use to actually get to know the tattvas. They are means of knowing, means of investigation. And the study of pramana and the debates around pramana is it's a hot fudge in Indian philosophy. It is perhaps the most boring types of conference you can attend in Indian philosophies are conferences on pramanas, yet for the initiate it is quite appealing and quite a mind training. So how do we get to know what are the pramanas, what are our methods? And this, I would say in a nutshell, right, this is the backbone of Indian philosophies. That's the strict minimum you will find somehow in different doxographies. And many have more than that. Some say present the views on liberations and so forth. But here, those three are the very backbone. And it's actually what we find in the Jain text that I have worked on of Haribhadra, right? So he actually focuses in his presentation on the apta, which he actually calls the devata here, the deity, right? So he presents apta, tattva, and pramanas and so forth. Now again, let's come back to the idea of what is a view, to that question. What is it? We have a pragmatic approach, okay, well, it's kind of view of a community. Now we also have a more technical approach, but let's speculate a bit more. Let's look at views in a more philosophical manner. So here I would say that, philosophically speaking, views are always convention. They are never reality itself. The notion of view, and particularly of right view, is a major significance in the context of the Noble Eightfold Path of Buddhism, right? Therein, the entire path rests upon the cultivation of right view and the abandonment of wrong view. For those who know, the Eightfold Path begins. The first, let's say, category, the first element of the Eightfold Path of Buddhism is right view. It is the pillar for all the rest of, let's say, the path of Buddhism. It is the pillar of the journey. One must establish the right view. With the wrong view, all the rest will be, say, mistaken in one way or another. This has led many to speculate that actually Buddhism cares about views much more than others, but I actually dispute that. Yeah? While seeing, drishti, view, darshana, and opinion, different terms we find in Sanskrit, coming back in the philosophical treatise, while these are certainly a capital lotus of transformation along the Buddhist path, they were equally important for the traditions of all the doxographers I studied. Jainism, with its notorious theory on the many-sidedness of reality, and its famous Anekantavada, and Advaita Vedanta, with its teachings on superimposition, Adhyaropa, and its removal, Appavada, were equally concerned with the impacts of views on one's relation to reality. For our three doxographers, we could say that views are the result of seeing can only be partial, conveying but a limited perspective on reality. Well, that's particularly a Jain approach, but we say that views will always be conceptual, always require a certain fabrication, and they can't be this ultimate non-conceptual reality. So it can be said that views superimpose various distinctions upon reality which are not part of its inherent nature, but are rather inbuilt within the seer and his seeing act to the various norms with which one interacts. In other words, views are tainted mental activity and not pure reality. They are caused by and cause further tainted activity, karma, if you want. Thus, they actuate the dynamics of samsara, the conventional world of perpetual reaction, and are ultimately to be abandoned by the jnana yogin. Let's say in a way, our views always influence our behaviors. If we have mistaken views, we will act in a mistaken way and create different karmas, positive, negative, which would bind us to the perpetual cycle of rebirth, something which the yogins want to escape from. So ultimate freedom then becomes the necessary cessation, here the nirvana, of such activity and of its associated disturbance. I would actually like to investigate further, actually, the relation between darshana or drishti and what in the Yoga Sutra is called chitta vritti, right? I believe there is a correlation between views in our mental activities and projection and what the yoga calls chitta vritti, just mental activities. In any case, freedom reappears here through the re-establishment of clear sight, here samyak darshana, very important concept, that was obscured through recurrent tainted activity. Views tend to hide reality. At best, if they are correct, and this is fundamental, they may directly point at reality through some pedagogical instruction. And this is what philosophical yoga is all about. It is about establishing, at least conventionally, right, this samyak darshana, the perfect sight, purifying one's view from different cognitive dissonance and intellectual obstacles and errors, and to establish that vision that allows us somehow then to perceive reality directly. But again, being conventional by nature, the views are never reality itself. Thus, for the philosopher, the Tarkika here, as for the mystic, which are but two sides of the same coin, what Bertrand Russell here presented as two interrelated human impulses towards science and mysticism, the practice of distinguishing views from the real is an essential component of the scientific and spiritual method. So both combine here Shastrika and Adhyatmika method in the Indian context which preoccupies us, constitute what I call the Jnana Marga, or the practice of Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge, the yogic cultivation of knowledge. My analysis suggests that doxographies are designed to transform one's view, that they seek to redirect it from the unreal, ersatz, to the real. Therefore, let's say I argue that the systematic classifications of views found in Indian doxographies is meaningful in the context of a particular religious training involving the student in a transformative dialectical study designed to help one discriminate genuine truth from its numerous ersatz, right? It's, say, sub-products. So I consider doxographies as spiritual exercise, and this is here that we could perhaps see them, yeah, as yogic exercise in some way. I borrow the term spiritual exercise from Pierre Hadot, who sought to show that what the ancient considered as pure theory, as abstraction, was in fact eminently practical, both in regards to its mode of exposition and to its finality. From this practical perspective, Hadot suggests that philosophy appears in its original form, not as a mere theoretical construct, but as a formative method, leading to a new way of life, a new way of seeing the world. In brief, philosophy, for Hadot, is a means to transform man. The work of Hadot has been discussed in dialectical context, especially in Buddhist context, at the beginning with McClintock and I'm forgetting Matthew Kapstein, sorry. And then there was a reply by Vincent Elchinger, who actually presented the view of Pierre Hadot and tried to see, can we use this category, this notion of spiritual exercises when we talk about Indian and Buddhist sources. And he presented, say, a set of reasons why we could and we could not. And 4 of them particularly interested me, and I want to present them to you. So he said that if the ancient philosophical discourse aims at transforming the disciple, it is because, as with Platonic dialogue, it tends to form rather than to inform, all right? Second, he says that thus a philosophical discourse is almost always addressed to a public belonging to a specific school. It is within these schools that such discourse are produced and transmitted among initiates. In this sectarian context, philosophy becomes a call to conversion. Every school engages its disciple in a new mode of being. Hadot explained this religio-philosophical conversion as a transformation of a mental order, which ranges from the simple modification of an opinion to the total transformation of one's personality. In the end, spiritual exercises seek to operate a radical change of being, a metamorphosis of personality, to guide one towards a higher level of perception, a universal perspective of sort. In this way, these exercises act as transformative vectors of change in one's worldview. Now, I want to go on each point one by one and explain why that fits particularly well when we think about Indian doxography. Concerning point 1, that to form rather than to inform, well, I suggest that the point of Indian doxography is primarily transformative before being informative. Perhaps a few words on that, but Indian doxographies are often blamed for their inaccuracy. It seems that they are not portraying the darshanas properly. And this, I think, can be explained perhaps by the context where the purpose of those sects is not particularly to inform correctly, but to transform its public, its reader. So doxography is designed to direct the student in a precise doctrinal direction signposted by rhetoric and dialectic, and not by historicity. The point is not merely to inform students about philosophical exotica, right? Doxography engages students in a dialogue with oneself, so with one's own views, with the views that are laid out by one's tradition, and with the wider world, with the views of others. Concerning point 2, that spiritual exercise are always addressed to a public belonging to a specific school. Well, Indian doxographies as a spiritual exercise, I say and I explain in the book, adopts different dialectical forms which are actually rooted in this sectarian affiliation, right? Each somehow school have a different approach to listing views and engaging in doxographical production. Concerning point 3, that a spiritual exercise is a call to conversion and transformation. My analysis of each of the 3 doxographies on the review seeks to elucidate that the dialectical teleology through which each doxographer is guiding his student towards the adoption of the only right view. That teleology I will illustrate in a brief moment. So in so doing, the author engages each student in a process of conversion and confirmation, depending on one's initial station within the mandala of views. In that sense, doxographies can engage with a broad array of students of different capacities. Now, I talked about, the spiritual exercise as framed and theorized in the classical world, and how we could use this as a category to talk about Indian sources. But to avoid the confusion of associating too closely the Greco-Roman world with the Indian one, I also adopt a terminology that's closer to home, and I locate these exercise within a known form of yoga or method that is dedicated to the cultivation of knowledge, of gnosis, the jnana here. I was invited in that direction by the notorious notion of jnana yoga, which is an expression that was explicitly used by at least 2 of my doxographers to describe their own path. It is also an expression that has a long history in Indian literature, as we find it in the Bhagavad Gita, in the Upanishad, in Sankhya as well. So I argue that no history of yoga here could be complete without the contribution of those yogins who took onto philosophy as a medium of transmission and transformation. And I call them the nerds of yoga here, hence the title of that talk, intellectuals and scholars. Indian doxographies, I say, are dialectical exercise designed to train oneself in establishing and maintaining one's view in the face of controversy. And ultimately, they are a guide to transcend all views. Now we get into perhaps the crux of the matter. We'll look here very briefly at each of the texts, and I will try to illustrate to you how these the structure of the text, their syntax perhaps speak perhaps just as much as their semantic, and how we can read here a teleology that is indicative even of the dialectical method that was designed by each school, in their philosophizing, in their path towards liberation and the cultivation of knowledge. So let's look at the first one from Bhaviveka, the Buddhist text, the Madhyamika Hridaya Karika. Here I already divided it a little bit to help you out in seeing. The text starts with 3 chapters. The third one is quite long. And then the 9th one, on the Mimamsa, is perhaps the longest after the third one. The first 3 chapters are first discussing why not to abandon the bodhicitta, right? The thought of enlightenment, why to cherish or to take refuge in monastic vow, and then the desire for knowledge, right? Tattvajnana eshana. These first 3 chapters form a unity through which Bhaviveka kind of presents his own perspective, yet he doesn't label it Madhyamika. He doesn't say Madhyamika Tattva like he did for the other chapter. What he does, especially in the 3rd chapter, he goes through all those categories of Abhidharma. Those who know Abhidharma Buddhism, it's, let's say, the principles or the or cognitive principle, or I mean, Abhidharma itself is kind of presenting a big map uh, of the human mind and of reality, and it works by classifying all sets of categories. So it's a systematization of the Buddha's teachings that are meant to be applied somehow to categorize and analyze one's meditative practice. Here, what Bhaviveka does is that he uses these categories and analyze them through a Madhyamika perspective to somehow establish emptiness, to show that all these categories have no svabhava, they don't have an ultimate nature. So he kind of used the categories of Abhidharma to establish his own without actually necessarily positing a thesis by itself. And once he does that, then he moves on to refute every other school. First, two other schools of Buddhism, the Shravaka, like perhaps we could call that early Buddhism, then Yogacara, and then he moves on to Brahmanical land with Sankhya, Vaisheshika, Vedanta, and Mimamsa. Although it's called Mimamsa, this chapter it's much broader and encompasses quite a big realm of everything that touches upon ritual practices and so forth. Now, if we look at it, the teleology that we see at play here is one in which the initial position, right, the initial view that is introduced is the one of the author. Although it is not exactly introduced as his own view, for the Madhyamika claims that it has no view of itself. Madhyamika's methods of analysis normally grinds the view of the others to kneel, to show that they rest on nothing, hence establishing emptiness. So the text works in a kind of descendant manner. The further we are from that initial position, the further we are from the truth. And it's a quite beautiful text somehow. And then through the, let's say, through the arguments that Bhaviveka gives, because he does, it's quite a long text, so in comparison to the other texts where there are not much argumentation, this one is quite argumentative. We see here Bhaviveka acting kind of like the philosopher in Plato's cave, where he goes down and he meets people at their level, he grinds their argument to kneel, and he kind of shows the way back to light, back to emptiness, right? We don't have so much time. I've already talked quite much, so I've moved on to the other text, and perhaps if you want to know more, you can ask in the question period, if you don't mind. If you look at the Jaina text now, we will see another model at play. Now, this is quite an interesting text. It's a very brief text, very skeletic. It has puzzled a lot of people. In general, scholars have tended to argue that there's actually no real structure, no real order at play here, that Haribhadra simply randomly presented a set of views, and that for them, for those scholars who argue that, was an illustration of the kind of open-mindedness, the neutrality, and the inclusivism of Haribhadra and of Jainism. I believe that is quite mistaken. What happens here is that the view of Haribhadra is right in the middle. It is funny because it's a text that calls itself the Compendiums of Six Views. We see that there are 7 here. The author itself is aware of that and tries to explain it. But he placed his view in the middle. And the Madhyastha, to occupy the middle position in Jainism, is quite significant, right? It's like being the Mount Meru. It's kind of showing that I am the Mount Meru of world philosophies. We are right at the center here. That also plays very well with the notion of Anekantavada, that I will argue, have a set of arguments for that one. Anekantavada, in a very briefly, tries to say that every view is valid from a certain perspective, right? And this is why people thought, well, that text actually is a beautiful display of Anekantavada. Everything is equal. Well, I would say here, well, it's not equal. The best view is clearly that of Jainism. It is also the only view that is properly introduced with praise of the Jina and so forth. But here, how that works, I would say, is that actually every view is perhaps equal from the perspective of the ultimate, right? If you're a Jina, if you're liberated, and you hear people debate, you will say, well, you know, these are all views. It's all kind of yeah, a limited perspective based on their understanding. But conventionally speaking, for someone who is engaged on the path and he wants to establish the right view, there's only one right path, and it's the Jaina path. It is the center. It is the dialectic of Anekantavada here that is at play. So the schematic here is that the view of the author has a central position, acting as the Mount Meru of world philosophy, and there's a kind of alternative equality of each views. So I will leave it as that. Perhaps we can come back at that within the question period. Now I move on to the third text I examined, Advaita Vedanta Sarva Siddhanta Sangraha, that is attributed to Shankara, although that is quite unlikely. Here, there's a lot we could say about that text, but again, to do what I had done before, let's look at where is the view of the author. So the author we know is a Vedantin, and his view happens to be the last one. And how we are to understand here, let's say the pedagogy of that text, because this teleology that I have shown in each of the texts can also be said to have a pedagogic function. So here the pedagogy works somehow like this. We begin with the most, let's say, gross, or the most basic view. If you remember, that's it, the Lokaita, the materialist, the Jains, and the Buddhists. So views that the Advaitins we consider to be Nastika, right? Those who don't believe in the Veda. And then there is a kind of progression toward the final crowning position of the Advaita. Now, there have been different ways of people like trying to make sense of that. I mean, I'm not the only one seeing it that way, although I believe I was the only one pointing out that that method of moving from the gross to subtle is actually pedagogical methods used by Shankara himself, in his teachings on the Upanishad. It's parts of the different Upanishadic sections. Let's say when Prajapati, so when the gods go meet their guru Prajapati, and they are taught progressively different views on the self, it moves from the gross to the subtle. In fact, recently I was reading Brian K. Smith's on Vedic rituals, and I realized that this pattern is actually a very old pattern that is even found in the Brahmanas, when the Brahmins philosophized about ritual and how to make sense of the different sections, different segments of the ritual. They also use this kind of schematic of moving from the gross to the subtle, right? So the best view here, again, is clearly that of the Advaita. Yet again, it is just a view that the teachings, as Shankara himself has said, the teachings found in the Shastras or even in the Upanishads, they are not paravidya, they are not ultimate, right? They are a paravidya, they are a finger pointing at the moon. And here we see again a progression. So I've been talking quite much. I will conclude and then open up for different questions. So I've argued that a spiritual exercise in Jin doxographies aim at transforming one's view. They act as some kind of programmatic vision therapy, where dialectic is used as a transformative tool. The semantic of views and even of therapy in medicine is a recurrent theme in Bhaviveka's text, but I would say it's quite pervasive in Indian philosophy. The idea that we have to somehow purify our sight. I argue that we could see doxographies as kind of a vaccination campaign, where you could inject yourself with the diminished views of the others, somehow to get kind of antibodies against the doshas, the mistakes of others. Any case, so those doxographies seek to redirect one's view from the unreal to the real, like that very famous mantra now, Asatoma Satgamaya. I don't know if you remember. There's also a song at the end of the Matrix 2, I think. In any case, I leave that on that. So views are but an authoritative set of principles, right, which must be analyzed with reason, here yukti, by the discriminator, the aspiring yogin on the path to ultimate freedom. So each view presents a set of tattvas, and these tattvas are the object of, say, yogic contemplation. They are to be analyzed. They are to be embedded in one's mind. They have to shape one's perception of reality in order to alter ultimately our behaviors, free ourselves from karma, and so forth. Only then can the nectar of truth, the tattva amrita, which is an expression very dear to Bhaviveka, be extracted from views, right, to a kind of dialogical torsion, tarka, of their linguistic and logical component. Now, perhaps a few words on tarka, but it seems etymologically, tarka means, like in French, tordre, to kind of squeeze out. And it is quite interesting that tarka, when we call philosophers tarkika, these people who argue, well, the practice of arguing, the practice of debating, is kind of a squeezing out, an extraction, right, of the essence of the teachings, the essence of these words and concepts. And by this kind of extraction, this squeezing out, like we had the extraction of Amrita, right, in the mythology from between the gods and the demons, right? They kind of put Mount Meru in the middle, and they try to extract this immortality nectar. And in kind of the same way, one could say that philosophy extracts the nectar of truth from concepts. So on this, I would like to thank you, say merci, and move on to your questions. I hope I was clear, and yeah, thank you. Perhaps one thing to add, I have an Instagram account on which in which I display lots of my photography and thoughts on my new project on list making in Indian philosophy, which is a continuity of my work on doxography. Thank you.
Well, thank you ever so much, Karl-Stéphan. That was a very stimulating talk. I enjoyed it a lot. I was delighted to hear your example of it's about taking the glasses off, taking off the spectacles, the lenses with which you see the world, because I've used that in a similar context, that yoga is the shedding of views and ideologies. Yeah, the way that you're approaching this material through lists, through doxographies is very refreshing, very appealing. And I'm certainly looking forward to the research on chittavritti and darshanas, or correct views. Can I remind everybody about the Slido link? So in the email that you received with the Zoom link for this, to get onto this, you also had the Slido link that takes you to a page where you can write up your questions. And if you write your questions with your name, then we'll be able to call on you individually to unmute yourselves and ask your questions. I think we have at least a quarter of an hour for questions, so do put anything up. We've got an anonymous question up already. Okay, we've got.
Perhaps I could stop sharing the screen, or.
Yeah, then we'll see you a little bit bigger.
All right.
Yeah, that'd be great. We have one anonymous question up, but I'll leave it for the moment. And if you want to edit that and put your name in, then please do. Jim Mallinson has a question for us, the director of the Centre of Yoga Studies. And I'm just going to unmute you, Jim. There you go.
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi. So I'm not going to put my camera on because I'm undressed. No, that's not quite true. Thanks very much, Karl-Stéphan. That was great. I'm just looking for my question. Now I've lost it. I've actually got two questions, but the second one's too long. That was fascinating. The first one is kind of pretty simple. In Roots of Yoga, we say that yoga is first said to be a darshana in the Sarva Siddhanta Sangraha. Would you agree? And do you have any thoughts on why it's not included in earlier doxographies?
So Sarva Siddhanta Sangraha here, the SSS, you mean the one attributed to Shankara, am I correct?
The one you've been working on, yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I got that from Halfas, I think.
All right. Well, I mean, the darshana itself was used by Haribhadra, right? And that's a few centuries before, certainly at least before the SSS, which we can't really date precisely. I am arguing for a datation between 10th and 14th century. So actually the systematic use of the term darshana.
Sorry, I think you might have misunderstood the question. The question was that when is yoga itself first recognized as a darshana?
I see. I'm sorry. I guess I was not concentrated. Yeah, in that way, for me, as long as as far as I've looked, that would be the case. I would believe that yoga would appear as a darshana within an Advaita context, and I believe that the earliest Advaita doxography was the SSS. However, there are other doxographies that discussed yoga, right, from Haribhadra itself, but they don't use the term darshana in that sense. So yes, on the top of my head, I would think that the term yoga and darshana appears there. I have a suggestion in the book why that could be so, but yeah, I would believe you are right on that. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's sort of faintly related question then. To what extent does the Madhyamaka Hridaya Karika's Yogacara sort of correspond to yoga practice as we might understand it, or Patanjali yoga? Is it as similar in any way?
Well, here it's the two sections of the MHK that deals with Buddhism are really built as an internal kind of dialogue, trying to justify first why Mahayana practice is worthy. That's for the Shravaka text. For the Yoga Chara section, we are dealing mainly with problems that Bhaviveka sees, where we could say the Yogacara is reifying Buddhist concepts, and then he tries to show that this is the wrong approach and empties them out. I'm not specializing in that section. I really looked closely in the Mimamsa section. So I wouldn't believe there is any close relation between here the Yogacara as presented in the MHK and, for example, Yoga Darshana as presented in the SSS, where we actually see yoga much closer to the SSS, actually happens in the Mimamsa chapter. There we have, is Veda Yoga as a Dvandva, I guess, or as a compound appearing, but we have Siddhi Yoga being mentioned. We have, focusing the mind on one point. I mean, he makes a lot of fun of people who believe in Shiva and who use it as an object of contemplation. The same for Krishna in a certain way. And that, to me, is quite interesting, because it seems for him that if we frame it, yoga within the Mimamsas, is that it's kind of this, he sees the same problem with yoga as a Shankara would have with yoga later, right? He sees the problem as this yoga being involved in a kind of causal, it's a mean. Yoga is a causal based type of means. I'm doing this in order to have this, like I'm gonna, make an offering to the fire and then I'm gonna go to heaven, right? Similar kind of reasoning, which he ridicules one by one in that chapter. That actually, in that section in the Mimamsa, that is come much closer to the yoga of Patanjali, though Patanjali is not mentioned. There are mentions that are pretty close, to at least the Bhashya and also the Bhagavad Gita, obviously. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, thanks ever so much. So we have an anonymous question. What's the modern status of the Indian doxography and how is it used? Is it different from its historical use?
This is quite interesting, and I'm happy somebody asked it. I don't know which doxography that person has in mind. Okay. However, when I started to work on doxography, I was actually a student at JNU, so at Jawaharlal Nehru University. I was doing my second master there for, I would say, for fun, right? To actually have an idea of how the Indians themselves are studying their own literature and so forth. What happened is that our classes on philosophy were often framed I mean, by doxographical categories, or they were just plainly using doxographies as textbooks. And that brought me first in contact with doxography. But then there's another thing which I thought perhaps I share with, which was more interesting. But my teacher of Vedanta at that time, he had an acute taste for these theories of science, especially modern science of, what do you call it, quantum physics and science and Vedanta. And as I built a friendship with him, he suggested to me a lot of books on science and Vedanta and so forth. And I was not particularly interested in all of it, but for the sake of friendship, I reviewed them. I read those books, and from Fridtjof Capra to so many others. And then those books were actually made by Indians on science and Vedanta were framed in a very particular way that I soon recognized. They would lay out the history of science as a kind of progression from gross mechanical science to kind of more abstract and theoretical to like quantum physics and so forth. And then at the top would come at the end Advaita or Vedanta somehow. So like Vedanta would appear at the end of these books as somehow crowning the achievements of modern science. And then I thought, well, that's quite interesting, because it seems to be like a pattern that I see in the doxographies of those Advaitins. Yeah, so at least in that kind of literature, I see here a doxographical structure, right? And that this again has a kind of it's kind of a way to promote, to sell, right? Kind of a marketing strategy. However, modern doxographies, I'm not aware of many. There was one, now forgive me, I think from Sharma. I don't think he would like that I call it a doxography, but kind of overview of Indian philosophy. And Sharma is not an Advaitin, he's more of a Dvaita, I think, right? So actually we see in his presentation a pretty favorable coverage of the dualist position of Advaita. I have read that a while ago, so I can't remember. So I can't say about others, about Indian texts that are more recent in terms of doxography. I would like to see that, actually. Curious, but I don't know. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. I've got another couple of questions. There's nothing more up in the Slido, but Jim, do you want to go for your longer question, or is it too big?
No, I just, so I didn't realize there's such a character limit on the Slido. It's not that long, but I just couldn't fit it in. I think it's because the text there is too long. Yeah, so I'll read it out what I've got anyway. So I thought, because I haven't read a lot of Indian doxographies, I thought they were all hierarchical and generally culminated in the darshana of the school that's presenting the doxography or that's being addressed. And so I've looked quite closely at the Sarva Darshana Sangraha, that seems to be thus. And I think you implied that the Sarva Siddhanta Sangraha is the same. But then I see from your presentation that the Madhyamaka Hridaya Karika is the reverse. So I just, I understand your argument from your book that these doxographies are spiritual exercises, but it seems slightly odd to me that if it's a spiritual exercise, that it should take you steadily down towards the, you said it was a descent to the kind of lowest form of darshana. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I think here we have to see how a Madhyamaka functions. And the problem, in such talks is that, well, we have to focus on this and that. I can't touch upon everything in the Madhyamaka system. It's rather complex in itself. But if we see it from the perspective that the Madhyamaka has no view, all right? So Madhyamaka itself, the truth, to the ultimate reality that the Madhyamikan philosopher perceive is totally devoid of any forms of view. Well, that's the case as well for the other ones, but also the method of how they proceed, yeah, in showing that is not by laying a set of arguments, as I said, is by destroying or grinding down or refuting, if you prefer in a more polite manner, right? Refuting others. So the way I see it is that the best view is actually having no view whatsoever, all right? And that is, cannot be written. So and there was and I forget his name, our fellow colleague at Oxford who deals with Madhyamika, right? Explains that the Madhyamika
Jan Westerhoff.
Exactly, I'm sorry, exactly. Jan Westerhoff explains that Madhyamika often proceeds by accepting Abhidharma category as, let's say, the best type of conventional thing. You know, if you need to have some kind of view, well, you can resort to that, right? But then Bhaviveka is interesting because he's one of those Madhyamika that actually kind of formulates a set of statements of his own, and he does that by dealing with the Abhidharma category, right? So at the beginning, you kind of have this initial position, which is a non-position. And then as you move on, you kind of move towards, I would say, the Mimamsa, which in the way I present it in the book, is about as far as you can be from the non-view. It's a very causal based, causal means, yeah, of achieving enlightenment, and he despises them, he makes fun of them, he jokes with them, he calls them arrogant and so forth, and the idea that they value ritual action over knowledge is for him unthinkable. But so to take the ideas at the beginning, you have zero view whatsoever. Then you can have the Abhidharma, and then the Shravaka, which, I mean, it's the teachings of the Buddha. And then if we categorize taxonomically or doxographically speaking, Bhaviveka is also, somebody who relies on the Sutra, Sautrantika. So you have the Shravakas and then the Yogachara, which are, for him, like they are reifying notions of Buddhism and so forth. Then we move to Sankhya. Actually, the relation of Sankhya to Buddhism, to me, should be theorized much further. I find it extremely close, especially if we take Sankhya and we remove the idea of Purusha, but we keep it like this. I think we almost have Buddhism there. In any case, so we have Sankhya and then other views, and we fall into hardcore, I would say, Hindu belief systems of today, so the Vedanta, and the Mimamsa. Although perhaps I should stress that again, I do mention that I see these texts as spiritual exercise, I see it as a pedagogy and so forth, but they are eminently political. Yeah, they have to be embedded in a social context. When Bhaviveka attacks the Hindus, there's a reason for that. And I try to explain that. So I don't want to like essentialize these texts and say they are only that, but I'm pointing at it to say, well, we've forgotten that they are also that, and that is more meaningful in the context of yoga, and that's why I'm talking about that right now. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, I did. Yes, no, that was great. Thank you. That
okay,
really explains it. Thank you.
Okay, we've got another question just popped up. How do doxographies relate to the standard dialectics in philosophical debates that have been theorized in Nyaya before doxographies were composed?
All right, would you mind reading it again just a bit slower?
How do doxographies relate to the standard dialectics in philosophical debates that have been theorized in Nyaya before doxographies were composed?
All right, so we have a Nyayika here. Well, good question. Again, if we were to go back at my definition of doxographies, I said that some doxographies, doxography might or might not have arguments. All right. So some, like if we take Haribhadra's doxographies, there is no argumentative framework here. All right. So in that case, we will say, well, there's no particular argument. So you would have to look for the Nyaya framework to, how the Nyaya is presented, but it's just kind of portrayed. It's like abstracted. Yeah. There are also not much argument in the SSS. The mode of refutation of the Advaitin is this kind of mode of progression. Now, the previous system is refuted simply because you move on closer to Advaita. They don't need to bother themselves with arguments. There are snippets here and there that you can see as kind of argumentative. However, in the doxography of Bhaviveka, which some people perhaps, if they have entertained a narrow definition of doxography, might not consider doxographical, but I have difficulty with that. So in the doxography of Bhaviveka, we have plenty, yeah, of argument. And now, so how does that relate with the Nyaya framework of debate? Well, actually, one who, I guess the person who asked that, you know, has a knowledge, you know, of Indian logic and knows that the Buddhists have their own framework of logic. It is somehow close to the Nyaya, but they, when they make an argument, right, they, the syllogism has a threefold structure, another fivefold structured, and so forth. So here nuances, okay, generally in the arguments of Bhaviveka, you have a threefold syllogical structure, but they are there, and some of them are really tasty. They're really fun. I mean, I've wrote about humor in the text. Some are very juicy argument. Some are actually not very appealing. Let's say intellectually, as well. Okay, it's kind of a vague, you know, vague, or I mean, unsatisfying arguments. Actually, unfortunately, the translations that exist so far of the Mimamsa chapter, I feel, do not render very well the actual syllogism and arguments. It's too many words have been added to the translation and kind of lose track of the punch, you know, of the argument. So yeah, in that sense, debate is fully there, and that makes total sense that debate is there for the Madhyamika, because the dialectic, the method, let's say the yogic method of Madhyamika is actually to grind down every view, right, to refute everything, right, through logic. So they need that in their doxography because it's their method. But in the Haribhadra system, they don't particularly need to do that. As I argued, it's as soon as you say syat after having presented our view, you say, well, you know, perspective here, move on to another one. You don't need to actually engage in so many debates. And same actually for the Advaitins, they don't particularly need to get into hardcore debates because this kind of broadening of views kind of implies that, well, the previous one is quite unsatisfactory. It's not getting to the essence. I mean, there is a beautiful rhetoric here, beautiful politic as well, which doesn't need the pitinity of argument. But here I'm not saying that Shankara does not argue, all right? If it was Shankara, perhaps he would have argued, and then his Bhashya is full of arguments, but that's not in the doxography, all right? So I guess that's, I hope it's an answer.
Thank you ever so much, Karl-Stéphan. So we are out of time. I'm afraid we can't take any more questions. So my one about the connections between darshanas and contemporary critical theory and positionality, I will have to hold on to it, and I'll have to order dialogue and doxography for the SOAS library because it's not there. I just had a quick check. So yes, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the SOAS Centre for Yoga Studies for your time and for your fascinating lecture. And we're poised to allow everybody to unmute themselves. So if you would like to unmute yourself, and you can start your video as well, then I'd like you to join me in thanking Karl-Stéphan Bouthillette for his presentation on doxography.